Hey guys, welcome back. So getting into Mike Costa's Venom vs. Host, which is a 5-part series which gives us the answer to where the Venom symbiote came from prior to Peter Parker bringing it back to Earth from the Secret Wars, and in addition to that, the birth of a new symbiote. So let's talk about this for a little bit. But first, if you're new to the channel, be sure to subscribe to catch the spills every week, and don't forget to hit that bell up top so we can squad up in the comments for the first hour. Alright, so when we first got this series, I'll admit, initially I was skeptical, and not because it was written by Mike Costa, but more so to the point of us getting a story or a retcon that would tie into the pre-existing origin of the symbiote that we got in the early 60s, with Peter Parker bringing the symbiote back from the original Secret Wars, then later discarding that symbiote, and immediately after, that symbiote bonding with Eddie Brock. And in addition to that, we also get the explanation for why the symbiote doesn't remember this history, to which I'll go into much more detail in just a little bit. But first, as far as the time of when this takes place, when Eddie comes to find out the events of this history, it's before the events of Donny Cates' Venom Volume 4, but after the birth of Carnage and the events that we had talked about before, where Flash Thompson had visited the other planet composed of Clintar during his time fighting alongside with the Guardians of the Galaxy. So we're post Age of Venom and pre-Donny Cates. And so at this time, in between those two events, we come to find out that the Venom symbiote has produced another offspring that they're allowing to be held at Alchemax under the supervision of Liz Osborn, Norman Osborn's wife. And they're doing this mainly for the purpose of it being watched over and allowing mild studies to see what different abilities it may have and finding out if it has any hostile traits or whatnot. But for the most part, it's kind of like a daycare situation. And in return, Liz also wants to study the symbiote and make a profit off of the research, which Eddie isn't too keen about, but at this point in time they do trust her enough to let it stay there for a little while so they can learn more about it before it ultimately bonds with a host. But on one particular day, after one of Eddie's regular visits, his symbiote notices that he's being followed, and when he tries to question the kid who he believes is following him, he's immediately attacked by an identical kid who turned out to be a Skrull, who blindsided him and was giving him the business. But while this is happening, she's then stopped by Tel-Kar, who is an escaped prisoner from the Kree-Skrull War, who confronts her, telling her to stay away from his symbiote. And you just gotta imagine, like, from Venom's perspective, this is like, wait, what? Interrupted by another wait, what? Because at first it's like, why is this Skrull attacking me? And then after that, immediately after that, it's like, who is this Kree and what could he possibly mean about his symbiote? Because Eddie and his symbiote share memories, which go back to his previous host, and up until this point, there's really no recollection of this guy. But at this moment when they see him, the symbiote tells Eddie that there's a familiarness about him and that instead of just standing by, that they need to help. And Eddie agrees to help him out, but he tells Tel-Kar that he'll save his butt here, but immediately after he needs to get some answers. And the reason that Venom knows that this guy isn't just randomly saying this or just making this up is because the symbiote remembers his scent but just doesn't remember where from. But after Eddie agrees to help, they do enough to get him out of there and get away from this Skrull that attacked them both. And so with Tel-Kar having taken severe injury, Venom takes him back to Alchemax so he can get stitched up and they can have the chance to talk to him and really find out what's going on. And when Liz sees this, she doesn't know what's going on, and she really doesn't want to know what's going on because she doesn't want to disturb anything and escalate and in turn have Galactus come after them or something. Like, yeah, she went there, she went off the deep end. But after Tel-Kar explained to Eddie that the memories are still there within the symbiote, but they were suppressed by the Kree because if Tel-Kar was captured, they needed to make sure that the Skrulls got none of their private intel. But after showing Eddie how to access these memories, we then discovered that the Kree found this symbiote that was an outcast from the others on his home world, and they used it as a tool to disguise Tel-Kar as a Skrull so that he could spy on them from within and attack when the time was right. And so during the war, at one point in time, he had blown his cover, saving some Kree prisoners, and in doing so, he discarded the symbiote, handing it over to the prisoners to return to Hala. And this way, the intel will get to an admiral and they'd be updated on his status. But this never happened because shortly after, as the prisoners were escaping and Tel-Kar was fighting off the Skrulls so they'd have the opportunity to get away, the symbiote rushed back to Tel-Kar, who was pretty much on a suicide run trying to buy them time. But as a result, both both of them were left behind, both Tel-Kar and the symbiote, as the prisoners got away. But it's from there that Tel-Kar does not know what happened to the symbiote. He explains to them that after years later, after being stolen as a prisoner and traded back to his sworn enemies, that he had finally escaped the Skrulls again, and years later, he had heard stories about Flash Thompson, who was from Earth, and from that moment, he made his way back so he could find the symbiote and they could be one again. And when he says all of this, the symbiote confirms that it's true, because once again, these are a combination of memories from Flash Thompson and other memories that have been suppressed that have now been released. And so after they're caught up with this history, Tel-Kar gives the symbiote the opportunity to return back to him, to which the symbiote declines because he's happy here with Eddie. And after hearing this response, Tel-Kar's like, okay, it's fine. Eddie, you're a lucky man. And then he just throws Liz out the window, escalating the situation rather quickly. And it's like, who would have thought Kree were this emotional? But when he does this, Venom of course has to save her, and when he does, Liz picks it up right away that hey, he's only doing this so he can get the other symbiote, which he discovered after making contact with Venom. And when Venom and Liz get back inside, Venom rushes to the lab only to find that Tel-Kar already has the young symbiote in his hands, threatening to take it and mold it into what he would want it to be, which forces Venom to make the decision to give his symbiote in exchange so that the young one isn't harmed, which was a very parental decision on Venom's behalf, because if he were to engage Tel-Kar and fight him for the younger symbiote, there's no telling what damage it could have done to that symbiote in the process. So at this point, when Tel-Kar leaves with the Venom symbiote instead, Eddie gets picked up by the throat by Liz, who's just screaming like, how could you let him take it? But we find out quickly that this wasn't Liz, but it was actually the Skrull who had tried to stop him in the first place. And from here, this Skrull, and her name is M. Lance, she tells Eddie the truth, the actual truth. Because in this narrative, Tel-Kar is the bad guy, and M. Lance is actually the reliable ally. And so from here, with M. Lance giving them the actual history of what happened, I'm gonna fill you guys in from like the very beginning all the way up to this point. Because the history that Tel-Kar told them, it was true, but he left out a lot of details. Because when we get into the actual truth in its entirety, when the Kree discovered this unnamed planet that happened to have symbiotic life on it, they discovered a symbiote that was separate from the rest and unbonded and more or less considered an outcast among its own, and they took this symbiote so that they can use it in the Kree-Skrull War to disguise themselves as a Skrull, much like Tel-Kar said, and they did so upon discovering that these symbiotes could also give you the ability to shapeshift, so then not only would their soldier blend in, but they would also have the abilities of a Skrull and shapeshift whenever needed. And when Tel-Kar was given the symbiote, he was selected amongst hundreds, because as many of you already know, the symbiote won't just bond with anyone. But in addition to doing so, the Kree genetically modified Tel-Kar so that in addition to bonding with the symbiote, he could also control it, suppressing the symbiote's thoughts and more or less making it bend to his will. And that's how he made his loosely true story believable and prevented the symbiote from returning back to Eddie after he had taken it and boarded his ship. And so, just to fill things in a little further, for those of you who didn't notice, the planet where the Kree had gotten this symbiote from, it was a product of the experimentation of Knull, the god of the symbiotes. And so if you're completely new and you're not sure who this is, I got a link below to his origin, which will fill you in on all of that. And so now if you guys remember when we talked about the origin of Knull, at one point in that video I'd mentioned where he had awoken on this unnamed planet after losing the Necro Sword, but it was here where he continued to experiment by drawing his creations from the living abyss, to which he found out there they would connect in symbiosis with the existing life on this planet, and it was there that we got the birth of the first symbiotes. And as we discussed before, we know from there Knull went from planet to planet experimenting on different species, but this is how the Kree got their hands on a symbiote and used it as their weapon during the Kree-Skrull War. And so as it turns out, Tel-Kar, most of his story is true. He did serve as a soldier, he did save many of the prisoners, and also made an attempt to return the symbiote so that his superiors would gain the intel and hopefully use it as a benefit towards winning the war. And so as M. Lance goes on to describe Tel-Kar's contributions during the months that he was undercover, she goes on to tell Eddie that the Skrulls still have no idea the extent of damage that he's done or the extent of damage that he had done and whether those were the leading causes of them losing the war. But much like he described, at the moment where he handed over the symbiote for the prisoners to take back to his people, he was then apprehended and interrogated, and to that point, fortunate enough for the Kree, he wasn't no snitch. But because he had never returned to his people and the symbiote had never made its way back to give them the intel, the Kree in turn considered him a deserter, and the reason that M. Lance went to Earth to destroy the symbiote was because she knew that Tel-Kar, who had revealed this information upon his escape, had hidden a biological weapon that will wipe out the Skrulls in their entirety. And at this point in time, after stealing the Venom symbiote, that's exactly where he's going. And so for Eddie, after being filled in on everything, he's like, okay, say no more, let's go and get my symbiote back. But M. Lance tells Eddie that there's no point in you going. At this point, you don't have your symbiote, and without it, you're just a man. And sure, she tells him like, you know, you look like you lift, bro, but in space, you're not gonna hold up. Which sounds kind of harsh, but it's true. But it's at this moment that it dawns on Eddie that he still has the young offspring symbiote. And the symbiote calls out to Eddie mainly because of their connection from the Venom Codex, telling him that we have to save my parent together. And when this young symbiote bonds with Eddie, they become a whole different beast with new abilities, different vision, and just way different than Venom. And with their combination of symbiosis, Eddie can actually go to space now and go after the Venom symbiote and have a much lower chance of getting killed in the process. Alright, so picking up where we left off with pretty much the backstory and how I'd mentioned in the previous video where this all stands as far as the time frame, as far as this narrative in relation to other Venom comics and the other flashback events in relation to other things that have happened in the history of Marvel Comics like the Kree-Skrull War, the origin of Knull, Guardians of the Galaxy, and so on. But with that, I just wanted to clear up one thing real quick, and this is in relation to a comment that I'd seen in the Squad Hour that was mentioned by Irvin Griffin Jr., shout out to Irvin, that I wanted to clear up real quick so that nobody gets confused. But he had pointed out when I mentioned as far as the origin of the Venom symbiote, which we had got in the original Secret Wars back in the early 80s, but when I'd mentioned it, I'd said 60s. And I just wanted to come back and clear that up so I don't throw off any of the new people who like, wait, what? But in addition to that, I'm glad he mentioned that because what I wanted to do at that point was just point out how all the different events that we see within Venom First Host connect into the continuity from Spider-Man in the early 60s, and from there through the Kree-Skrull War through the 70s, and from there to the first appearance of Venom in the 80s, and even more so moving forward throughout the origin of Carnage, and even more current day, the origin of Knull, which I should have spent a little bit more time clearing up because while I was thinking 80s, I said 60s, so I just wanted to iron that out so none of the new people get confused. And in addition to where a few others were asking if this lines up with the whole narrative of Deadpool getting the symbiote before Peter Parker then putting it back, to which I did a video on a long time ago, back when we were talking about Deadpool Back in Black, and for that particular instance, I'm gonna go ahead and say no because it came off more like your just fun narrative, and that's something that could change. They could make it canon, but at this point, I'm gonna just go with a no because there's no other details holding that solid. But if you're new here and you're not familiar with that narrative, I got a link down in the description where you can check that out because I compare that much more to your Deadpool What If series that we've gotten prior to that point. But moving forward from where I'd mentioned with Tel-Kar taking the Venom symbiote and M. Lance revealing herself and her mission to stop Tel-Kar because the entire race of the Skrulls depended on it, because Tel-Kar had hidden the details to a biological weapon that he had designed to wipe out the Skrulls in their entirety, which is what he head out to do immediately after taking the Venom symbiote. And what I find hilarious is a lot of you guys' feedback talking about Tel-Kar being that angry ex who comes back and is like, Eddie Brock? The dude that's hiding his kid from the world and want to hide the world from his kid at Alchemax? Because Tel-Kar is low-key the soldier boy of the Venom symbiote, and Knull will be the soldier boy of symbiotes everywhere. Like, just imagine millions of years in the future when Loki gets the Necro Sword, if Knull pops up and he's just like, Loki, he stole my whole flow. Like, that would be the greatest comeback of 2018, 2019. That would be the greatest comeback of Marvel Legacy. But getting back to First Host, with the young symbiote that Eddie was hiding from the world, reached out to Eddie through their bond, which is a bond that we've learned through many of the studies from the Maker, and also the recent return of Carnage is a bond that stays with the host even when their symbiote is removed. This young symbiote used it to reach out to Eddie, telling Eddie that they should bond together so they can save the Venom symbiote, who at this time is under the mindless influence of Tel-Kar. And from the moment that they first bond together, we start to get into the new abilities of this symbiote, because off the rip, he can see things that are invisible. And what he does after discovering this is he tells M. Lance, hey, let's just hop in that invisible ship you got floating right outside and get up out of here. And after doing that, she doesn't even argue. She's like, all right, let's go. And with that, I gotta say, even though there's no hint of this happening anytime soon, like, I just can't wait till Miles Morales comes face to face with this symbiote and gives him the creepy Superman I can see you eye. And I'm telling you guys, like, when that happens, this is exactly how I want it to go down, because I know Miles will be just as freaked out. And I said just as freaked out, not just as freaked out. So now the next ability that we find out that the symbiote is capable of is like a chemical pheromone type of distribution, to where it can sense the pheromones of others and use that information either to detect their different emotions or take that same information to distribute its own pheromones to create emotions for that particular species, be it confusion, euphoria, or perhaps even put them to sleep. And when Eddie explains all of this to M. Lance, really just telling her how it can be beneficial, to where initially she doesn't really see the benefit outside of him being able to see the invisible, but rather just going further with his explanation on the pheromones, he goes on to tell her, how do you know I didn't use it on you in order to convince you to take me with you on this trip? To which she responds like, yeah, do it again and I'll kill you. But also included with this ability to detect pheromones and use that information to modify and project its own, it's also able to make its host invisible. And I mean virtually undetectable to any other organic species. And from what we know at this point, he's able to do it better than any other symbiote that have shown traits of cloaking, much like the examples that we've seen with Venom being able to bypass Spider-Man's spider sense, but with this guy, it's a whole nother level. And once again, this mainly just takes effect to organic creatures. Like, I'm pretty sure this wouldn't work on like an infrared sight type of thing. But at this point in time, with them closing in on Telkar's location, who has infiltrated a Skrull base under the disguise of M. Lance while en route to Skrull space, this actually turns out to be the location where Telkar was keeping the biological weapon that he had hidden to destroy the entire Skrull population. And so at this point, M. Lance and Eddie Brock, they're aware of where this location is because they had cross footage with Telkar using his symbiote control enhancements, and in doing so, Alchemax recognized some of the patterns as an actual map. And that's what gave Eddie and M. Lance an actual location to head to, because prior to, this particular site was top secret and M. Lance didn't even know about it. And when they get close to this location, the symbiote actually puts M. Lance to sleep while they're trying out and demonstrating its new abilities, and Eddie doesn't bother to wake her up because the ship protocol warns them of the security black team, which usually greets the unannounced ships that dock, but Eddie discovers that they've been taken out along with the other Skrulls at this location, because little did they know that Telkar was already here and he's already started to use the Skrull killing endgame bioweapon, which he's a little late for because the Kree-Skrull war has been over, which tells you a lot about Telkar because he's the type to go for the win even if nobody's in the gym and the lights are turned off. But with Telkar aware of the arrival of Eddie and M. Lance, he tells Eddie over the PA system that this is actually a research facility that the Skrulls had built for testing biological weapons, which makes a lot of sense that he would choose this location given all the top secret information he collected as a spy. And in addition to that, all the recent security protocols he had recently just taken from the Skrulls who were here moments earlier by using the symbiote and his enhancements to probe their minds. But with him being aware that Eddie's here, he cranks up the incinerator, which is hot enough to purge the containment of who or whatever's in that closed area, but Eddie was able to avoid this by going invisible and avoiding the reach of the flames, and doing so with waiting for the perfect time for Telkar to come down so he could attack. But this plan, even though it was clutch, it didn't really work for much longer because Telkar used the Venom symbiote to detect Eddie Brock's location, and as a counter he activated one of the nearby flamethrowers in the incinerator. And so from there, when Eddie grabbed Telkar and told the young symbiote to put him to sleep, because he's burnt and injured badly, he can hardly combat the influence of Telkar. But rather what he does is pretty interesting, because when they make contact, he speaks to the Venom symbiote, telling him that he has to fight this influence or else Eddie and the young symbiote will die by the hand of the Venom symbiote. And this immediately gives the Venom symbiote the motivation to fight as hard as possible for control. And even though the Venom symbiote with fighting back doesn't get absolute control, it is just enough to throw Telkar off focus, leaving him vulnerable for attack. And M. Lance, who has awoken from her sedation, takes her shot with no hesitation. And she steps in at this point wearing her spacesuit, you know, with Skrull killing biological chemicals having just been in the room and all that, to which I'm sure have all been pretty much burnt out, but hey, it's better to be safe than sorry. But even with doing this, Telkar gets the upper hand just enough to damage her spacesuit, leaving her exposed to the remaining toxins in the room. And immediately the young symbiote goes to protect her, and Telkar, who uses this brief moment as an opportunity to get the Venom symbiote off of himself, which gives Eddie the perfect opportunity to redon the Venom symbiote. And at this point with the tables turned, Telkar really doesn't stand a chance between these two. But at this point it doesn't so much matter because he already sent out a signal to the Kree Empire letting them know that he's found his symbiote and he's ready to return. But to Telkar's surprise, they open fire on the station because at this point, since the Kree-Skrull war, the Kree very much much like the Skrulls, they have changed their leadership, they have different objectives. Hala's been destroyed at this point, they have different leaders. Like, it's a completely different climate, because the Kree general even goes on to explain that Talkar was sold to the Skrulls as a war criminal, which of course was something we already knew, but he even went further to explain that the Kree still consider him a traitor and a deserter. And this is another one of those things that solidifies Venom First Host with more of the history in Marvel Comics. Because back in 2015 when we got the introduction to the Black Vortex, which was a crossover event that stretched between Guardians of the Galaxy, All New X-Men, and Legendary Star-Lord, and I want to say even like Guardians Team Up. But in this event, which was pretty much like a galaxy world war, if there's actually a word for that. But during this time with everyone trying to get the Black Vortex, which was pretty much like this ancient black mirror that could fully max out whoever uses its power, which of course some wanted to use for evil, others like the Kree just wanted to destroy. But ultimately in this fight, Hala was destroyed, and it was from then moving forward that the Kree considered weapons of mass destruction or any unorthodox weapon that was highly dangerous not to be used again. And Peter Quill's dad destroying the planet, it didn't help either. And so in Venom First Host, when the Kree general makes this reference and orders his squadron to destroy this base, this is more like a precautionary step taken in order to sustain the safety of the remaining Kree survivors. But while this is going on and M. Lance has to get rid of her spacesuit because of the damage from the fight with Talkar, she fully dons the young symbiote, and from there the four of them just get out of there, leaving Talkar, mainly because the Venom symbiote didn't want to help him and risk the chance of becoming once again a slave to his influence. But M. Lance along with Venom take this opportunity to escape, and doing so without the Kree Armada chasing them, mainly because Talkar made this call for backup before they had arrived, so the Kree didn't know that they were there. But upon returning to Earth, M. Lance really just drops off Venom there with the symbiote offspring, and from there M. Lance leaves Earth, returning back to Skrull space. And when she does, she makes the clever remark of, you know, if you're ever in Skrull space, don't look for me. But more so in a joking matter of like, if you really ever need to team up again, you know where to find me. But immediately after this, Eddie goes back to Alchemax to speak to Liz and possibly continue the research with the young symbiote, which thus far has been helping with research for the Venom symbiote as well as their offspring. But when Eddie goes to Alchemax, he's not allowed to see Liz, and this is mainly because Norman Osborn restricted Eddie Brock's clearance. But after this had happened and Eddie got a chance to speak to Norman Osborn, and they really just went for drinks and had a talk. But when this had happened and they had a talk, they both connected off of the fact of being fathers and just wanting the best for their offspring is something that has made them both better men. But not long after this encounter, when Eddie returns back to his apartment, he's met by Talkar, who survived the Kree attack and made his way to Earth, presumably just running on pure hatred. But he made his way back to Earth with the intention of killing the young symbiote. And at this point, with having no true mission or no true purpose, he mainly just wanted to do this solely out of revenge. And his plan to execute this was to use a modified version of the biological weapon that was going to destroy the Skrulls that he had put together using a sample of Eddie Brock's blood. And with Venom refusing to let him do this without a fight, the young symbiote takes the canister, then the Venom symbiote attacks Telkar, and it's from there that Eddie just goes for what he knows and attacks Telkar without wearing either symbiote. And it's like kind of a callback to the comment that M. Lance made, saying that he wouldn't hold up, which is partially true because Eddie is human and he's not as strong or as quick as a Kree. But as a callback to the comment from M. Lance saying that he wouldn't hold up in space without a symbiote, and also a bit of a callback to his conversation with Norman Osborn, mentioning he'll do whatever it takes to protect his family, this gets Eddie in a crazy spot to where Telkar is about to snap his neck. But before he does, the young symbiote crawls down and merges with Telkar. And like, you would think, like, why would he do that? So he can be controlled just like the Venom symbiote was. But when he does it, it's quite the opposite, because when he merges with Telkar, he lobotomizes his mind and uses his body as a host for himself that he has complete control over. And it's really a bittersweet moment with a little poetic justice sprinkled on top, because when the young symbiote does this, he tells Eddie like, hey, I just did to him what he was trying to do to me and the Venom symbiote. And during this symbiosis process, he removed all of Telkar's enhancements in what I'm sure was a pretty painful way. And after doing this, he tells Eddie that he has access to all of Telkar's memories, to which we found out from earlier stretch across the galaxy over a number of years. And in addition to that, the young symbiote that is going to use this new strength and this new knowledge to search the universe because he wants more answers answers. Like, he's been locked in a box literally his whole life. And for that reason, he wants to get out there, explore, see more things, learn more things, and perhaps later return being better all because of it. But it's these events unfolding in this way which gives us the new symbiote named Sleeper. And with the conclusion ending with Sleeper pretty much leaving Earth and going on this mission abroad to see more and to learn more, to me it just comes off like a clever way to get Sleeper out of the picture to really explain why he hasn't been there in the more recent issues. And in my opinion, that's something we can always later get in like a solo series or something to really fill us in on what happened between the conclusion of Venom First Host and whichever issue in Marvel Legacy they decide to bring him back in. But that'll do it for this one, guys. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. Let me know, when do you think will be the best time to bring Sleeper back? Let me know down in the comments below, like at what point in Marvel Legacy would be like the craziest time for him to pop up. And in addition to that, would you like to get a solo series? But either way, let me know your thoughts down in the comments below, and we'll do it again on the next one. Alright, later.